You described anybody who challenged the climate change consensus as, quote, crackpots and conspiracy theorists. So what is it?
I do think we should also always challenge the science. Of course we should. There's a healthy debate amongst climate change scientists. But the vast majority of climate change scientists believe that climate change is happening and that man-made activity is causing it. So it's a tiny number of people who believe that it's not happening, that man isn't responsible for it. And I have to say I agree with President Obama in his recent. I'm not against debate. What we've seen in the press,
newspaper should
no, I didn't say that. What I've actually said, and I completely stand by that, is that we've seen a completely unchallenged view of the climate change deniers. I think we need to have rather more balance in the debate, particularly when we saw a recent analysis of 12,000 scientific papers, and of the scientists who expressed a view, these are climate change papers, of the scientists who expressed a view, 97% said that climate change is happening and that it was human-made activity.
That survey, of course, has been substantially discredited.
Well, I don't believe that has.
No, it has. Let me just tell you. 35% of the abstracts were misclassified, and they were classified to the pro-global warming side. Professor Richard Toll, the expert most quoted approvingly in the Stern report, has disassociated himself from that and said it's not reliable.
Well, if you look at what the scientists are saying, take the chief scientist of the government who's just stepped down, Sir John Beddington. You and I, through our taxes, pay for these scientists. He said in his speech as he left that the evidence was unequivocal, unambiguous. The chief scientist of my department, Professor Davey, is of a similar view. So I have to say the science is on the side that we need to take action. And let's just hang on for a second. Let's just imagine that the huge majority of scientists are wrong. Let's just say that climate change deniers are right. Do you think it's sensible that we gamble, that we say, well, actually, even though most of the scientists say it's happening, we should ignore them? I say that we take a cautious approach, and just as you and many others, I hope all your viewers, insure their houses against the very unlikely chance of fire burning their house down, I think, given the risks of climate change are much greater, with more devastating effects for humankind, we should actually invest in a little insurance policy to tackle climate change.
Well, let's this graph going up here. This shows temperatures rising since 1980. It's a trend. We flattened out a little bit just to get rid of the ups and downs. That's the trend. Then it rises, and then it's suddenly around 1997 it plateaus, and it's still plateauing. Isn't that a bit of a puzzle?
Well, actually, no. When you talk to people at the Met Office, at the Hadley Centre, they expect in their models that there'll be short-term variation in this century, a rather longer time series than we've shown there. If you took that much longer, you'd find at the beginning of the 20th century there was a plateau. In the 1950s there was a plateau.
But that was nothing to do with global warming.
So the short, well, of course we were emitting.
No, yes, the IPCC report says that the real CO2 emission rising temperatures really clicked in after 1980. Now there is no.
No, I'm afraid you're wrong.
There is no net model. There is no net model that predicted this plateau.
Well, first of all, you're completely wrong to suggest that people in the climate change science community think it only started in 1980. That is simply not true. And in terms of the most recent decade, let's remember, that was the warmest on record. And even if you look at the temperature analysis, that is pretty striking. But I think that's a very narrow way of looking at climate change science. If you talk to the climate change scientist community, you've got to look at things like the temperature of the seas, because that's surface and land surface temperature. The oceans have continued to warm. You've got to look at sea levels. The sea levels have continued to rise.
Let me show you this.
It's very important we hear the actual science, because you're not showing the full picture.
Let me show you this.
The ice caps are continuing to melt. All that is part of
Okay, but we still have a puzzle. We still have a puzzle, because this is the temperature, and here we have superimposed the carbon dioxide, the CO2, going up in quantity. Now, is there not, at least when you look at that, clear that there is at least the possibility, I put it no higher than that there is something of a disconnect now between CO2 emissions and temperatures?
If you had a longer time series, most climate change scientists would say that's completely consistent with data we've seen previously. And I go back.
The climate scientists can't explain this disconnect at the moment.
Well, what there's no, they can actually. A lot of them are saying.
Well, let me put to you. Let me react to this. But this is just to amplify the question. Then you get to react to it. This is Doug Smith, leading climate scientist at the Met Office. It's fair to say that the world warmed even less than our forecasts suggested. We don't really understand at the moment why that is. Yeah, and so we don't know why there's a disconnect.
And I went to the Met Office recently. I did a speech at the Met Office, talked to their leading scientists. Doug Smith was there. And what they're saying is you shouldn't just look at surface temperature. You should look at the temperature of the oceans. You should look at the level of the sea, which are still rising. You should look at the ice caps that's still melting. You should look at the increasing frequency of severe weather events. So if you just look at one bit of information, which is what you're doing today, I'm afraid you're not seeing the full picture.
Just sticking with that one bit of information, when this plateau started to develop, and some academics started writing about it in 2006, the people who advise you, such as Phil Jones at the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia, again a world centre of climate science, he described the idea of a plateau as nonsense and stupid. The Met Office denied that a plateau was even happening.
And Andrew, that's why, as I said in my Met speech, which you read out a few minutes ago, I think we should have healthy scepticism within the climate change science. Right. Why? Because climate science is incredibly complicated. It's new, innovative science, and so no one actually, if you talk to the climate change scientists, including the people you mentioned, none of them actually say we know everything for sure. Of course they don't. A few scientists ever say that about anything. But the question is, would you be prepared? Is any government prepared to take a gamble on the future of our planet when the vast majority of the science shows that climate change is happening?
On this plateau, though, you've said that simulations show this plateau happening. The Met Office could produce none that show that this plateau could have happened. Scientists at the University of Hamburg, which is one of the world's leading centres, institutes of climate science, they have looked at all the climate models, they run the simulations, and they produce a 15-year plateau in only 2% of the simulations. They just don't happen on the models you depend on. If I can just show you what the professor at the Climate Institute in Hamburg has said, if things continue as they have been in five years, at the latest, we'll need to acknowledge that something is fundamentally wrong with our climate models.
Well, very interesting. I'd obviously like to see more of that, but since when you just quoted Dr. Doug Smith of the Met Office, you came to a conclusion which the Met Office wouldn't have agreed with. I don't know what the University of Hamburg thinks, whether they think climate change is clearly not happening, or whether, as in that quote actually they're saying, we need to look at our models. No one is suggesting, I'm not suggesting, I don't think climate change scientists are suggesting, that we know our models are completely perfect. That would be nonsense to suggest that. But given the evidence, not just in temperature rises, which is what you're focusing on today, you're ignoring all the things I'm saying about the rising heat in the oceans, the caps on the ice caps, the Arctic and Antarctic, the rising sea levels, extreme weather events. Why are you choosing to ignore that?
Well, because I'm sticking to the temperature, because that is what the computer models are most concentrated on. I could get into ocean temperatures with you, and I could point out that the Arctic ice melt did not happen other than normally this year, and that last winter grew back. But I want to stick with the temperature. I want to stick with the temperature. Professor Storch says that if there is a 20-year plateau, then we'll need to have a fundamental re-examination of climate change policy. Not to abandon it, but to wonder whether we should be doing it so quickly and in the way we're doing it. Now, the Met is now predicting, that's the Met that denied a plateau was happening, by saying that this plateau could now continue till 2017. That would be 20 years. If it's still plateau in 20 years, will you re-evaluate the situation?
Well, we re-evaluate our policy all along, but the climate change science, under the fact that the world is warming because of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, I think is unambiguous. The science is clear, the physics is completely uncontested, that if you put carbon emissions in the atmosphere, it warms up the world. That is uncontested. What is a debate, and that's quite a reasonable debate, is how quickly that is happening, and looking at all the different aspects of it. But that does not mean that we shouldn't take action. Not only if you take the insurance argument that I've talked about, if there's a risk, surely you insure against it, but also because the things we are doing, making people's homes warmer through energy efficiency, investing in clean energy that doesn't pollute. That's good for people's health. It also creates jobs. If you go to China, and I'm speaking actually later today to the relevant minister from China about what's happening there, they're worried about pollution from coal power stations, not simply because of climate change, but because of the air pollution it's causing. So there are many reasons for taking our policies. Let me finish this point, because one of the great things about the way we're tackling climate change is a lot of our policies are no regrets. If you've actually cleaned up the energy,
yes,
cleaned up the atmosphere, is that something to be regretted? Absolutely not.
All right, but your policies are hugely expensive. They're over £400 billion in the Climate Change Act. That's the £400 billion is in
I'm happy to talk about
the Act. The point I'm trying to get to is that